happiness, there's a big dispute in a sense. Now there's a fashion for trying to measure happiness and to create a measurement of general well-being. I'm fairly skeptical myself of that sort of endeavor. In a sense, it would have like two sort of meanings, if I can talk very grandly and very, very sort of crudely in a way. There's a sense that happiness is serenity.
Esto es La Inquietud con Garret Edwards, el lugar donde hay más preguntas que certezas.
Damos vuelta de página aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario. Tenemos un enorme honor, placer y privilegio. Él es profesor emérito de Teoría, Política e investigador en la Universidad de Glasgow, en Escocia, en Gran Bretaña. Entre sus trabajos, coeditó el volumen The Oxford Handbook of Adam Smith. También ha publicado La idea de la sociedad comercial en la ilustración escocesa, que tiene traducciones en japonés y en chino. Publicó también La teoría social de la ilustración escocesa a través de la editorial de la Universidad de Edimburgo. La idea de Lujo con la Universidad de Cambridge. Entre sus publicaciones más recientes se encuentran ensayos sobre Hume, Smith y la ilustración escocesa y una breve introducción a Adam Smith, publicado con la editorial de la Universidad de Oxford. Ha sido invitado a dar conferencias en Japón, en China, en Chile, en Brasil y también en Europa y en los Estados Unidos. Es un miembro electo de la Royal Society of Edinburgh, lo que sería la Academia Nacional Escocesa, de la cual Adam Smith fue uno de sus miembros fundadores. No es otro que Christopher J. Berry. And now I'm going to transition into English. Christopher, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Garret Edwards on the other side.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Christopher, we are pleased to have you. You wrote a very short introduction to Adam Smith. How would you introduce Adam Smith to millennials in 2022? Oh, you have it there, right next to you.
So I think it's how would I introduce him to current audiences? I would partly be cautionary to say that his name gets used often, but often sort of out of context and as a sort of rather glib shorthand. So part of my work and lots of other people's work on Smith is to try and get behind that and beyond that, to indicate the greater depth of Smith, and he's not to be pigeonholed in some particular ideological niche.
That's really interesting. So it seems that we are talking more and more about Smith, but we are not maybe understanding exactly what we are saying about Smith.
Yes. I mean, that's well, it's the same with many great thinkers. I mean, because you have people encapsulate or simplify it into various slogans. Father of economics, for example, is a standard Smithian one. And at one level, there can be nothing wrong with that. But if you really want to sort of find out what Smith himself was thinking, what motivated him, what influenced him, and so on, then you have to go deeper. And so anyone who's interested needs to go deeper.
So we need to go deeper, and you just mentioned one of the faces that people usually think about when they think about Smith, the father of economics. I have here with me the theory of moral sentiments, and I have here with me as well an inquiry into the nature of the wealth of nations. Many a thing has been written about Adam Smith, two seminal books on how they relate to each other. What's Christopher Berry's take on these sides of Smith?
Well, Smith is one person, one thinker, and therefore it's a mistake to think in somehow or other he has a split brain, but part of his brain deals with moral philosophy and the other part deals with what we now loosely call economics. Because, in fact, Smith's work as a whole hangs together in a more or less coherent way, it means that also the wealth of nations, also the moral sentiments, and facets of the moral sentiments, the earlier work, percolate into the thinking and sometimes the language of the well-known wealth of nations. So there isn't a real divide. It's just a specialization of focus. But the approach is quite similar, and the sort of problems I try to understand what it is that's going on when we make moral judgments, and what's going on when we try and understand how productivity exists and how wealth is created. It's the same sort of inquisitive enterprise in both cases.
I'll keep you on the counterfactuals because you have researched both Smith and Hume thoroughly. Do you think it would have been possible to have either of them without them meeting and being friends? Was that really an important part of their development, or is that just like an anecdote that goes side to side with them?
I think it's rather more than an anecdote, because there's enough evidence to indicate that they weren't sort of, to use a cliche, passing ships. They interacted. It's a fairly well, I think, substantiated story that when Smith was marooned in Oxford after an education in Glasgow, he read Hume's book. And the impression given, I think, is that he thought this was the way to go forward. Hume himself said in the preface to the treatise, which is what we're talking about here, that he was trying to put philosophy on a new footing. He was trying to establish the proper science of man. And I'm inclined to think that in many ways that was an agenda that Smith himself took up and proceeded with throughout his writings. And when they sort of met each other largely in Edinburgh, they clearly were on the same sort of intellectual wavelength. And because of that, there was a sort of interchange between them. Hume made some quite serious criticisms of the early editions of the Moral Sentiments. Smith, for his part, acknowledged Hume, and he did acknowledge many people. Smith is, like many 18th century writers, didn't bother saying who he was cited, but he did make an exception of citing Hume, for example, in the Wealth of Nations. And it's the case that Hume, when he basically was on his literal deathbed, managed to get the Wealth of Nations read and wrote and said, great book. Now, in that situation, there's no reason why you should say that. So in one way, it's an endorsement of, I think, Hume's admiration and respect for a scholar of fairly similar intellectual capacity.
Yeah, it's like when the Beatles acknowledge the Rolling Stones and vice versa, right?
Yes.
You wrote the idea of luxury. What's this idea of luxury, Christopher?
Oh, that it was a difficult question to answer. That's why the book took a long time to write, and it's quite complicated. What I was trying to do in the book was two things. One was to provide an account of what is luxury, like a conceptual inquiry, and I have my own take on that. And then the second part of the book looks at the story of the changing conceptions and evaluations of luxury basically from the Greeks up until 19th century. And then the final part of the book looks at certain problems that are related to that in terms of distribution, needs, meeting needs, and political decisions, for example, about what's a luxury and what's a necessity when it comes to taxation, for example. So it's a very hybrid and composite sort of book. It has been, if I can say myself, fairly influential, and has many citations in the literature from when it was published, and it still sells.
Because I guess books have become a necessity and not a luxury as they used to be way back when.
Oh yes, and that is one of my examples about that books are not taxed in the UK. There's no consumer's tax on books in the USA. Other countries do tax literature.
Christopher, what do you think the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers would say about luxury nowadays?
Oh, nowadays, they would be, I think, a bit ambivalent, like most people are a bit ambivalent. By and large, they would see it as a sort of vindication of modernity. That is to say that luxury is an expression of, or a symptom of, depending on your particular way of putting it this, of increased productivity, increased wealth. The average GDP has gone up, the average person is better off, and in part they are able to, in quote, enjoy luxuries which before they weren't able to. And that simply reflects how social change can be measured in a shift from what was regarded as a luxury good to what becomes a necessary component of human life. Because that is a sort of, should I say, escalator, then in a sense they would regard this as a sense of vindication of what Smith called commercial society. Like most people, they would have certain qualms about some of the consequences of that. Maybe the extent to which it privatizes individuals a bit, they concentrate more on their own fulfillment, if you like, in the way of producing, enjoying material goods. A certain extent to which it might mean that they are less sociable and less communitarianly minded. But these, I think, would be comparatively minor consequences of what they say. Now, some of the Scots took a very moralist view still and said that luxury corrupts a nation and weakens a nation and so on. Smith and Hume, for example, don't think that, in the sense to say that the luxury is a symptom of wealth, and wealth is a symptom of strength. And strength means you're able, for example, to defend yourself against enemies more than you could in earlier circumstances.
Christopher, there's this other thing that you have also researched throughout your life, and it's not a small thing at all. It's happiness. Is luxury related to happiness?
Well, it's related, but that's a very weak, connection in some sort of way. As the cliche said, the only person who describes riches as someone who's never been it. So that happiness, there's a big dispute in a sense. Now there's a fashion for trying to measure happiness and to create a measurement of general well-being. I'm fairly skeptical myself of that sort of endeavor. In a sense, it would have like two sort of meanings, if I can talk very grandly and very, very sort of crudely in a way. There's a sense that happiness is serenity. That is to say, with a sort of contentment that you have, you are happy in yourself, you're happy in your environment, and it's what the Stoics would call apatheia. That you're lacking sort of passion, you're lacking in a sense restlessness, you're lacking always striving, and therefore on a treadmill. So you're never quite satisfied because always something above the horizon that you want to try and capture, and then you get that there's something else that you want to capture, and so on. So it's a rejection of that, and to be serene. Now, the other view is to say that happiness basically is a sort of is a more material flourishing. That in a sense, it's something that you achieve. It's something that you get through activity. Not through being serene and, in a sense, contemplatively, but something that's active. It's something that, in a sense, enables you to fulfill whatever it is that you want to achieve in life. So you're only happy when you're searching for things, looking for things, striving for things, trying to make things better for you, better for others, and so on. And so there are, in a sense, these two rather different models of how we conceptualize happiness, and both are valid in their own way. Both, one might say, well, a bit of both is what we're looking for. But and then I was looking at, in a sense, how happiness then links to, in a sense, satisfaction. And the particular view that comes from the luxury stuff is: are people always aspiring and striving to get what they perceive to be luxury goods? So it's an incentivizing dimension. And then when they get it, as I said before, they may well not. They assimilate quite quickly and get used to it. And so they want to find something else, or the latest thing that they want to try and pursue. So there's sort of restlessness to that aspect of things.
Christopher, when you started researching on happiness and luxury, what was the most surprising thing you found out when doing so? Because I guess you started with a hypothesis or many hypotheses, and along the way, you must have found things that surprised you.
I think, what in a sense, this surprised me, but what in a sense I discovered, which I didn't think I might do because I wasn't very hazy. So it was a question basically of refining maybe intuitions or refining aspects. And it was in a sense that there is for me anyway, and this is controversial, most people perhaps don't accept this, that luxury is nothing to do with expense, is nothing to do, well, it's not necessarily to do with expense, necessarily to do with rarity. A luxury is something that I call a treat. It's something that you can painlessly substitute. Now, that's not something I started off with. That was in trying to think through what does it mean to enjoy luxury, or to be a luxury in a sense. It is to something that will be an indulgence, something that you can easily do without. If you really want something, it's not a luxury. One of my examples is,
that's lovely. The phrase,
for example, I've got a jigsaw, and there's a piece missing. Then you really, really want that missing piece. So getting that missing piece is not a luxury. That's a necessity, a self-imposed necessity. And other goods are simply valuable because you cherish them. Other goods are simply instrumental. They're a means to an end. Luxury as a treat is not a means to an end. It's its own end. And so getting to that sort of conclusion, it seems to me, does capture what I think luxury is, but that's my philosophical conceptual analysis for doing it. But in terms of your question, surprise is probably a bit strong, but in a sense, it was discovery to my own mind of how the argument went.
Christopher, you have given lectures all across the globe and also in Asia, including Japan and China. Your books have been translated to Japanese and Chinese. How are Hume and Smith perceived in Asia?
Well, excuse me a second.
No problem. It's perfect.
Again, to sort of crudely generalize.
Yes, of course.
They represent in a way, it seems to me, what from the Asian perspective is a quintessential Western approach to wealth and well-being. It's an alternative from, say, if you take the sort of, particularly the Chinese version, and why Chinese scholars, it's an alternative to a sort of rather crude Marxist determinism. Because they are rather more aware of other factors than simply a sort of base superstructure model that you would get in sort of Marx. And also because even if they remain as logically Marxist, it's a useful counterweight, an informative, as it were, alternative view that they would need to combat if they wanted to retain, as the Chinese regime does, Marxism with Chinese characteristics is the standard way of putting it. So in one sense, they're interested because it looks like an alternative that is relatively viable, because that basically, for their point of view, underpins the sort of Western US hegemony of the world. Japan is slightly different because it's slightly more historically rooted, I think, in as much as when Japan was a very closed society, you probably know, until the sort of late 19th century. And they opened up, the Meiji decided to open up to the world and develop themselves from being a largely hierarchical, largely peasant, well, the agricultural country anyway. And they were confronted with a couple of models, if you like, for doing this. One was a sort of Marxist model, and the other was a sort of Smithian liberal model. And so for the similar sort of reasons to the Chinese, they fastened upon the sort of Smithian model as a way, how can we develop? How can we develop? And it means things like the rule of law. It means investing in individual initiative and so on. So at the scholarly level, there are just genuine scholars who are just interested in what these people like Hume Smith said. And there's quite now, Japan's had a long history of good scholarship in Hume and Smith. The Chinese are catching up. They are translating lots of books. Although Smith gets retranslated every generation, it seems, because they start correcting the original translations, which were slanted to a particular audience at the time. So they're getting more scholarly about things.
Christopher, we've been talking about Hume, and there's this thing that it has always struck me as ironic. I had the chance to visit Edinburgh twice, and Hume's statue, people usually touch its toe and its feet, and it's kind of a superstition, and it's for good luck and everything. What do you think Hume would say or think about that?
He would be dismayed. He would be dismayed. He might be dismayed the fact that he's portrayed as a Roman, for one thing, in the statue, in the Royal Mile. Also because one of his recurring and predominant themes is a critique of superstition. He thinks that science of man and general science, is the way to improve human life. And superstition is simply reflecting of ignorance. So the fact that people do this just shows the other side to Hume, which is quite realistic and pessimistic, and says, well, actually you can't get rid of it. Human nature is so sort of besotted or involved in this sense, the need for some form of external reassurance or some form of explanation for patterns. They can't accept contingency, can't accept randomness, always trying to find an explanation. And superstition is an example of that. There's always got to be something to account for it. And not accepting scientific. So in a sense, it's the sort of anti-vaxxers, that's the sort of superstition who are sort of saying, well, I'm happy eating this or putting disinfectant down myself, like Trump apparently said at one point. That's just an example of ignorance and not taking scientific knowledge and the learning behind it with sufficient seriousness. That's the way that, in fact, you've got a vaccine in the first place. So I think, in terms of your question, I think you must say will be dismayed. Nothing has changed, but then again, I didn't really expect it to be changed. People always believe in miracles.
The last question, Christopher, we ask out of every interview here on this show because it's called in Spanish La Inquietud, and it's a pun in Spanish. At least we choose one version to ask it when we do them in English. What makes Christopher J. Berry restless?
What makes us forget? Well, Christopher J. Berry is quite old now. So in one sense, I'm probably more on the serene level for the happiness view. I think I'm still sort of curious. I think I still find there are problems I just like to sort of work out and work through. I'm still sort of, trying to get my head around problems. So in one sense, the restlessness is the view that as long as my brain still fires, the synapses are still working, I will probably carry on reading and carrying on asking questions about what I'm reading, and then questions about the questions what I'm reading. So that's the restlessness, I think, that might characterize me.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for your time and for sharing it with our audience. We send you a really, really big hug from Argentina.
Okay, thank you very much, Garret. Thank you.
Lo teníamos a Christopher J. Berry aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario.
Esto fue La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. Síguenos en redes sociales y en www.edwards.com.ar.